Hello, welcome to the Prostasia Conversations, Prostasia's monthly podcast series. I'm Noah Berlatsky, Prostasia's new Director of Communications, and I'll be hosting this series going forward. Thank you for joining us. So for my first interview, I am thrilled to be talking to writer, sex educator, and general vortex of awesomeness, Heather Carina. Heather is the founder and director of the long-running sex education website Scarleteen, and they've written numerous books, including the Sex Education Handbook, SEX, a comic book with art by Isabella Rotman called Wait, What? A comic book guide to relationships, bodies, and growing up. And most recently, they've written What Fresh Hell Is This? Perimenopause, Menopause, Other Indignities, and You. Today, we're going to be talking to Heather about sex education, child sexual abuse, and more. So, hi, Heather. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me here. Hopefully there won't also be doggus interrupt us.
Oh, well, we could have that on my end as well. I think she's asleep, but if somebody knocks at the door, there will be much excitement. So, all right. So I thought I'd start, after, I read the book SEX for this. And, as I said, sort of my big question was, you mentioned dating someone who brought along a weasel. So I kind of, what was the deal with that? Because you just sort of mentioned it off to the side in your book.
I don't know. I have a million weird date stories. I think one of the things that it's funny that we always notice with younger people now, I have so many weird date stories because I'm quantity. I've been on a lot of dates, so many dates. I do not fear bad dates is I think some of my best dating advice that I have. Bad dates equals excellent stories. Sometimes the power goes out for days. Winter is long. We've just been in lockdown, right? So we've just had evidence of good stories. We all need them. But yeah, Wizard the Weasel once attended a date of mine. And yeah, right? Bad date equals good story. And especially if you're a writer, we truck in these things. Which is more valuable, a good story or a good date? Who's to say?
All right. So I wanted to, how did you get involved in sex education? What led you to want to provide sex ed resources for young people?
It's a multi-tiered question. When I was in high school, I was definitely people that I went to high school with are not surprised that what I did. And basically, usually they'll be you were always having sex. And I think that what they mean by that, besides that, yes, technically that is true, is that I was a person that they knew was having sex, right? I think that I was one of the identifiable people who was having sex, who would talk about having sex, right? And was not uncomfortable talking about having sex, So one, I think even as a queer person, even as a person maybe not exactly having all of the most permissible kinds of sex. It was the 80s and it was Chicago, so there wasn't a whole lot that was not particularly permissible, but still I think that, early on in my life, it was identified that I was pretty comfortable talking about this. And even in ways that I was uncomfortable with it, I was okay being uncomfortable. I think a lot of times that people will say, oh, it's so awkward. And sometimes to me, even if it is awkward, that I don't necessarily have a problem with it being awkward. But, even before I did Scarleteen, when I was teaching early childhood ed, I would be identified as that person. The questions that the teachers didn't want to deal with and the sticky situations, literally sometimes that the other teachers didn't want to deal with, it would be oh, ask Heather, right? So, but with Scarleteen, I was, as you probably remember, 5 people in the world probably remember, I was running Scarlet Letters at the time, which was an adult site about sexuality. And there were so few things on the internet. There really even wasn't that much porn on the internet at that point. There were so few things about sex and sexuality on the internet that young people would find Scarlet Letters. And there was some advice and information on there. So they were writing in with questions. I would look for somewhere to refer them. There was not anywhere to refer them. Most of the questions were things I felt comfortable answering. Again, just as a person who was in my 20s, a sexual person, I grew up around public health people, like I knew what to do. So I started to answer the questions and, it got really, it got really out of control. And, here we are. Something that I love about human sexuality and sex ed is you can never really get bored, right? We can never know everything. It's one of those things that's impossible to exhaust. You're always learning things. Things are always changing. So it's never like, oh, I know all there is to know about this. I'm just going to go home now, right?
Well, that's sort of the topic of your most recent book, right? Is sort of discovering, right. Learning about perimenopause and menopause. So I know scarletine has been sort of very controversial, and people have been unwilling. I don't know if people have tried to take the site down, but they've been unwilling to link there. And so I get sort of like, what barriers have there been to sort of providing frank sexual advice for young people, and sort of how have you managed to sort of keep it going for 20 years now, right?
Yeah, I mean, the barriers have changed with the climate changing, and what the barriers are changing. Like way back in the day with scarletine, at the dawn of the internet. I feel like I need like some weird like 2001 music going on in the background when I'm seeing that. But when you used to try and get a web host, you had to like put down a deposit. And then you'd, upload all your stuff. We had like 3 different times where we'd put down a deposit and then we'd upload everything. And then they'd be like, oh no, we don't like that. We're keeping your deposit and you can't be here anymore. That happened like 3 times. Thankfully, like shout out to the Stockroom in Los Angeles who actually guest hosted our space. I mean, we had a couple people. Our hosting company that we have right now, FCI Incorporated, that used to be Flying Croc. Basically, we're like, we mostly host porn. We don't care. And now they've been our hosting company since 2002. I mean, a really, really long time. I don't even think they do that much hosting anymore. But there's, it's the nice thing is that for all the barriers that you have, you definitely will find the people out there that really appreciate what you do and will be kind. So, first it was things like that. We've definitely had huge waves of harassment. We've had people try and hack the site and take the site down. I've been stalked. I'm back home, but I moved from here simply because I was stalked, and that was absolutely about scarletine. So we've had all kinds of stuff. I mean, one of the big things is that, in our staff, with very few exceptions over the years, we're mostly volunteer. I was volunteer until, I don't know, almost 10 years into scarletine. But most of the other people that are on the team at scarletine are young people themselves. Most of the rest of our team is under 30. So I think one of the things that it's really important to mention is that most of the other help that I've had are young people for whom this is really important. So one of the ways that we've stayed running is that it's really mattered to other young people that we do this.
So talking about like people who kind of are uncomfortable having the site exist, I know that conservatives, but also kind of progressives will sometimes argue that like teaching young people about sex like puts them at risk or is harmful. And I guess you saw that with like the recent go round of sort of like kink at whether it's okay to have kink at Pride. So I guess like, what is your response? Like, why is it important and valuable that there be, sex education for young people, and why, what do you say to people who say that this is dangerous or a problem?
I think that I have very rarely in my life heard anyone from a marginalized position, argue for silence, right? Like, the only time that I ever hear arguments for not talking about things, it generally comes from people in a position of power, right? People who don't want to talk about race are usually white people. People who don't want to talk about economic inequality are generally people with wealth. People who don't want to talk about immigration are generally people who are, they're not immigrants or recent immigrants. And certainly I think that the same is absolutely true when it comes to things like sex ed. People that say that we shouldn't be talking about it are often people who, either don't need it anymore, or have access to other ways of getting it, or don't. I mean, to say don't need it anymore is kind of a misnomer, because I think a lot of times people do need it. They just don't realize what they're missing out on, or what they didn't get, or how they could have benefited. I think it's just a lot of there's a lot of people who do harm to other people sexually, whether that harm is done by things like sexual abuse, right? Or whether that harm is done by things like, controlling the sexuality of other people in any way, right? But heteronormativity kind of controlling, or transphobia kind of controlling, that the silencing to want people to not have sex ed really perpetuates all of that, right? And I think that that's one of the things that, kind of gets swept under the rug a lot. And I think particularly once we start talking about sex and sexual abuse, right? Like, one of the biggest things for me, if we kind of even go back to the beginning of the conversation about why I work in sex ed, is, one of the other things is that, as a sexual abuse survivor, a really big piece of healing for me was figuring out and, really tangibly the difference between what was sexual abuse and what sex is, and seeing how different they are, right? That it's really not as fine a line as it's sometimes presented. It's really so different in some really fundamental ways. But if people don't have sex education, right? And if we're not talking to people about things like pleasure and what pleasure is, and consent and what consent is, then no one can know that, right? And that gives people with power, whether the power that they're looking for, like I said, is to be predatory, right, and abuse people directly with sexual abuse, or whether it's to be controlled, right, and keep people sexually behaving in a way that gives people other kinds of power. There's a reason people are so threatened by sex ed in this way, and some of those reasons fall into that category. And I think it's difficult to talk about, because obviously it makes people really squeamish. Everybody's going to immediately leap to I'm not an abuser, I'm not a controller, but it's also too, we're at a point of time where hopefully right now we can start to talk about the levels of this where, well, maybe you are and maybe you aren't. But even if you aren't, what do you enable, right? Or what don't you enable? Or what are you working on, and what are you doing or not doing to dismantle that?
So I know parents are also, one thing that people have been very concerned about since I guess Scarlet Teen's been up and running is, the idea of that, how the internet affects young people, or sort of like sexual content that's available on the internet, and sort of concerns about watching porn or sexting or, sharing sexual information. One of the interesting things in your book was that you kind of talked about, that there are dangers, but there are also kind of things that are safer in some ways. So I guess, could you talk about what are sort of the dangers of the internet, and what sort of are maybe some good things about it in terms of, sexuality for kids, and what the risks are for them?
Sure. I think it's interesting that we're talking about this right now, post-lockdown, actually, right? Because even if you just think about, even if we're just talking about physical health right now, to kind of think about this on the other side of this and recognize, obviously not everybody was going to be following the rules. Everybody's human. People, crawl out of windows. It's a thing that everybody does of all ages. But, even if you just think about how many young people in lockdown were keeping their sexual behavior to only online during COVID, instead of going and meeting each other illicitly and, really literally spreading a plague at the time. And there's a lot of, just to kind of start with the positives, I think, one of the things is that I think a lot of people presume that right from the start, anything that young people are doing online is immediately about sending a ton of naked pictures. And that is really far removed from a lot of young people's reality. A lot of what it is communication, right? So a lot of what's happening, for one, I kind of liken it to when I think about couples 100 years ago that were courting by sending letters back and forth, before they were even meeting. It's so funny to listen to people now get really critical about this kind of relationship here. And I thought, well, are you critical about your great-grandparents' relationship that started that way? Because it was probably really similar if you had people in your family in wartime that started their relationships this way. And that allows, them to be building intimacy with each other. That allows them to be having patterns of communication in a way that can be really safe and make them feel a little bit safer. They're in their own spaces. They're not having to necessarily navigate how they're feeling. Everybody remembers what it's like. It can still even be like this now, right? As an adult, when you're in close physical proximity to somebody that you're into and, everything's firing off, and it's just makes everything so much more difficult to navigate. So just to even kind of have that one thing removed while you're getting to know each other a little bit and when you're learning how to talk to each other and set some boundaries, that's a big deal. Another thing, even speaking of setting boundaries, is, when somebody is not abiding by your boundaries, it is a whole lot easier to just click a little X in a window to make somebody go away than it is to get them out of your bedroom, and that's just a fact of the matter. What else? Even when, everybody's going to have their mixed feelings about young people trying on different identities and different roles, but being able to do that online is really creative. That allows people to kind of put on different ways of being sexual in a much lower stakes way than to do it in person in a physical way can be, especially when you're talking and I'm not just talking about, physical as in you get sick or you get hurt. I'm even talking about the social stakes of, say, doing it in front of everybody in an American high school, right, which is not a particularly, generally a particularly supportive social space for most people. I could go on. Really, there's a lot of things. And I think that one of those things is also, too, I would say to parents who don't know what those things are, that's a great conversation to have with a young person, because also their answers are all going to be different. Some of what I said, some young people, that's not going to be the answers for them at all. They're going to have totally different answers. And some of what I said, they might not even, some of those things might be their bad things and not their good things. And again, though, there are some problematic things, right? There are some things that aren't safe. There are absolutely people that groom online, and it can be easier to be groomed online. Certainly when it comes to things where you are sharing things that are intimate, whether that's words, whether that's pictures, you can absolutely have your trust betrayed. You can be exposed in really bad ways. And as some of our laws here can really, really mess you up if you share it wrong.
In your book, there's kind of I guess it's a little old, but it's a pretty terrifying statistic that 70% of people from 14 to 17 have been abused in some way, I guess like assaulted or neglected. So you said 30% sexual assault and 40% sort of abused or neglected in other ways. And that was from a 2013 study. And I guess, like, does that sort of fit with your experience talking with people at Scarlettine? I mean, do the majority of people who come in have some sort of experience with abuse and neglect, or?
I mean, young people are not treated well in the world that we live in, right? Like, and I think, when we're defining abuse is absolutely, especially to include neglect, all kinds of neglect, and abuse to include all kinds of abuse, including emotional abuse, absolutely. And the longer that, sometimes when we have people that we talk to, so there's some people that we talk to and it's a one-off, right? We talk to them once, maybe they have like a, how do I use my birth control question, and we never get into anything like this with them. Sometimes we'll have somebody else that's a one-off that it is a question like this. Other people, sometimes they'll stay for years. The longer that we talk to somebody, the more we find out. But it's, generally, often the longer that we talk to someone, especially if we're talking to them and they're taking in information about what healthy relationships are, about how people should treat each other and how they should be treated. It's not uncommon for people who kind of come in thinking everything's fine to come out with revelations and be like, oh, this thing happened to me. This was not okay. And that was not okay. And, who it comes from varies. So often it's from parents or other adults. That's not uncommon. Or from peers. Also not uncommon, or extended family, or from siblings, often from people that, we entrust to protect us or our children in our lives, teachers, babysitters, and especially when we're talking about things like emotional abuse, verbal abuse, neglect. I think those things, people blow them off all of the time. Or file them under something else, their discipline, or it's deserved, and I think that's another thing that will happen a lot, which is that young people will not count something as abuse because they will say that they deserved it, right? So you're only abused if it's not deserved. If what happened to you is deserved, it's punishment, which is, to their minds, to a lot of people's minds, different than abuse, because abuse is only undeserved harm. Punishment is deserved harm.
So what could we do as a sort of society to sort of like make it so that we're not, harming more than half of children or something?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think from as soon as we can, one is we don't, right? Like, we are much more mindful from minute one with all of the children that we're around about treating them with care and respect. And we're really thoughtful about it, right? Like, and really intentional about it. But also we are educating them. We're making sure, I think, a lot of people don't tell their children how they should be treated, so they don't have to be accountable, right? But if we educate them about how they need to be treated, kids are really great at holding us accountable if we give them the information, because kids have a very implicit sense of fairness, right? So when something isn't fair to them, how many times, if you have a kid around, have you heard them yell that it's not fair, right? Whether it's to them or somebody else. So when they have the information to know from you what is or isn't fair, they'll tell you when it isn't. It's just that if we haven't told them, right, things like, whether it's that it's not okay to smack somebody, right? Or that it's not okay to tell someone they have to hug or kiss someone. Right. So if we tell them, if we give them all this information and then we let them hold us accountable, And when they do hold us accountable, we 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 hold ourselves accountable. And instead of saying, "Oh, well, it's different when it's your Uncle Joe. Oh, well, it's different because you did this thing." We say, "You're right. I'm not supposed to hit you." Or, "You're right. You don't have to hug your Uncle Joe." Right? That we take accountability. I mean, that's really it.
I guess the last question, I was kind of curious what do young people ask you?
Oh gosh. I mean, it's so many things. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, in some ways, it's evergreen, right? If you think about the things that probably you would have asked when you're younger, it's those things. It's, and it's, people have concerns about normalcy. Of course, the answer to that is you're both normal and no one's normal, right? Like, and both of these things are true. And you're normal because no one's normal, right? Like, there is no normal, so everyone's normal, is what it is. It's really common for people to be sure that wherever they are when it comes to their sexual experience or dating experience, that they're not on the right place on the timeline, right? That they're behind or they're ahead or although right now it's more behind. I think that one thing that's happened is that, in this particular generation, it's definitely, people are kind of moving slower than they were at our age. So I think that probably compared to parents, it's behind. And so if they're looking at older media or things like that, they're kind of getting the sense that they're behind, even though nobody's behind, right? Wherever anybody is exactly the right place for them to be. But I think there's a feeling of behind. And I'm sure that right now, with pandemic and everything else, and everybody kind of feeling like they had a year and a half of being frozen in time, that's all the more pervasive. Always with identity, I kind of wonder when, if ever, we could land at the place where people realize that there's never you will know your forever identity, like that there's no such thing as a forever sexual identity, but that kind of still remains a concern. But also, I think too, there's that adolescent thing of really wanting to nail down, know who you are, and be done with it. Like, God, you're like, I hate to tell you that this is like a lifelong existential crisis, and I really hate to tell you, when you're 15, there's so much of this ahead of you, but this never ends, friend. What else? There's always too, there's that thing of when you're, in a relationship and trying to figure out if you stay in it or if you go, when you're at that thing, especially too, I think that still a lot of young people are getting very mixed messages from our culture, even though historically, people, after, I don't know, the 1600s or so, staying forever, a whole lifetime with the first person that they dated is really, really uncommon. To stuff, when we're talking and things that go out to families, I mean, I will say that worries about family acceptance remain huge. Whether family acceptance is about, I'm sexual. I mean, we still have so many users that hide masturbation because they're terrified that parents would think poorly of them if they knew, that hide sex with a partner, even when their partner is they love this person, right? They love this person, they've been with them a couple of years even. What more do you want for your kid, right? Except that the two people involved love each other. Or it's about identity, or it's about, just bodies, or it's about what they're into. There's still so much, just wanting family acceptance.
All right. Well, I think that's it. Thank you for coming. This was great. I really appreciate you doing this.